All right, guys, this is one of the last systems we're going to talk about, and this is the endocrine system. Before you get started, I recommend that you go back to the beginning of the year and you watch that signal transduction pathway video. So the video that we talk about some of the different types of receptors and what a signal transduction pathway is, as this correlates directly with how the endocrine system works. So what are hormones? Hormones are pretty much anything that are going to stimulate other cells and cause a physiological response. And they act in an endocrine fashion, or some hormones act in an endocrine fashion. And what does an endocrine fashion mean? Well, that means that the hormone is going to be released from these endocrine glands, and they are going to travel through the blood and affect target tissues. And there are several different types of hormones. Luckily, you don't have to memorize all the different functions and where they're located or where they're produced from. But you should be able to pretty much just be able to go through a couple of examples and mostly talk about how they negatively and positively feed back on one another. So some examples of hormones that you may have heard of or that we are going to talk about: things like growth hormone releasing hormone, involved in allowing individuals to grow; oxytocin, which is involved in the milk letdown response in females; things like melatonin, which is responsible for skin pigmentation; and then a couple others that we're going to talk about, things like luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, and those are pretty involved in spermatogenesis and oogenesis and in the menstrual cycle. So what are some of the different parts of the endocrine system? Well, the endocrine system is highly regulated by three main parts, or actually really four. The first is this area located in the brain, and that is the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus is pretty much the master regulatory organ of the endocrine system. It's going to produce some hormone, for example, growth hormone releasing hormone, and then it's going to travel down through a series of portals, essentially, or blood portals, to the either anterior pituitary or the posterior pituitary gland. And each of these parts of the pituitary are going to release different types of hormone. And so, for example, the hypothalamus will release growth hormone releasing hormone, which triggers the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone, which is then going to go and affect target tissues. Now, we also have the adrenal gland that plays a pretty important part in some hormones and some hormonal regulation. So what are the two main types of hormones? This should be a review, but there are two main types of hormones that we're familiar with: steroid hormones and peptide hormones. Steroid hormones, remember, are hydrophobic. They're lipid soluble, and so they can easily transverse the plasma membrane, and so their receptors are going to be located inside of the cytoplasm. Once that receptor binds, or once the steroid hormone binds to its receptor, it's then going to go and target the DNA inside the cell and cause transcription for whatever it needs to produce. This is different from peptide hormones, which are hydrophilic, which means water-loving. They're non-lipid soluble, so they cannot easily pass that membrane. And so what has to happen is they have to bind to the outside of the cell membrane using something like a receptor tyrosine kinase, an RTK, a G protein coupled receptor, a cytokine receptor. And they're going to use a secondary messenger. Remember that secondary messenger we talked about with CAMP? Well, there are several others. We have things called cGMP. You have calcium can be a secondary messenger, and then inositol triphosphate, or IP3, can also be a secondary messenger. So now I briefly want to go through a couple of examples of what these, some example endocrine examples can be. So if you look over here, for example, the hypothalamus is going to release gonadotropin releasing hormone. And this gonadotropin releasing hormone is then going to go and stimulate the pituitary to release two hormones, FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These hormones are then going to directly stimulate the testicles, which is then going to also stimulate the production of testosterone. Now, what's important to notice here is that once enough testosterone is reached, or once enough testosterone has been produced, it's going to negatively feed back on the hypothalamus and the pituitary. Remember, negative feedback. So once this testosterone is high enough in quantity, it's going to come back here and negatively feed back on the pituitary and shut it down, meaning the pituitary is no longer going to produce FSH and LH. Similarly, it's going to do that to the hypothalamus. It's pretty much going to shut the hypothalamus down and stop producing gonadotropin-releasing hormone so that this pathway doesn't continue. So there's an example of a negative feedback loop here. Another example of hormonal control of a body system is the menstrual cycle involved with females. So the hypothalamus, again, is going to produce gonadotropin-releasing hormone. It's going to stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to release LH and FSH, just like what we're seeing over here. Although in females, it's going to stimulate the ovaries. And in the ovaries, we're going to produce two main types of hormones, estrogen and progesterone. And that is going to stimulate the shedding of the uterus. And so there's two examples of feedback here. When estrogen is in really low numbers, it's going to positively feed back on the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. Meaning in low numbers, estrogen is going to continuously stimulate these two things to continue to produce those hormones so more and more estrogen can be produced. Well, once enough estrogen and progesterone are created, then they're going to negatively feed back on those and shut it down, meaning we don't need any more, you don't need to produce GnRH, and we don't need to produce LH and FSH. And this is how the menstrual cycle is regulated through estrogen, progesterone, and positive and negative feedback loops. And then the last example of hormonal control is kidney function. So a decrease in blood volume or an increase in osmotic concentration will both trigger the kidney to start to osmoregulate or reabsorb water. So in the case of a decrease in blood volume, it's going to trigger some heart receptors, and we don't really know how this happens. And those heart receptors are then going to stimulate the posterior pituitary gland to release something called ADH, antidiuretic hormone. These ADH are going to increase the permeability in the kidneys. So in the kidneys, there's a section called a distal tubule, and that's where all of the water and salts are going to get reabsorbed. ADH works by recruiting things called aquaporins, which are water channels that allow the reabsorption of water back into the blood. So if our blood volume is decreasing, that means we're losing water. The posterior pituitary stimulates ADH, which is going to recruit aquaporins to the membrane, causing all that water that would be lost through urine to be reabsorbed back into the water. What happens? We increase blood volume and then we shut this system down. So it's a negative feedback loop here. This is different from an increase in osmotic concentration. So that means the solute concentration is increasing, meaning that we don't have a lot of water, and similarly the same thing is going to happen. Although there are receptors in the hypothalamus that sense this, and it stimulates the posterior pituitary to release ADH, and the same process follows. Once we increase blood volume and decrease that osmotic concentration or decrease that solute concentration, it negatively feeds back to the hypothalamus and says, stop, we don't need to produce any more ADH. So in this video, I've given you several examples of how hormones work. You do not need to know any specific functions. However, you should be able to take a multiple choice question, given enough information, and describe feedback loops. Describe the relationship between what the problem is saying and what it's producing. Mainly focus on feedback loops. You have to know or be able to determine that from an example what kind of feedback loop is occurring and what the relationship is.